Got it. So tonight we're talking about the two names Huron and Wyandotte. And I think a lot of us have a good idea as to the source and the way in which we obtain the name Wyandotte, but there's a lot of confusion about the name Huron. And a lot of what we're talking about tonight is going to focus on the name Huron. And our objectives, a little bit of what we kind of talked about at the gathering. We're going to briefly rediscuss some of those points that we discussed in regards to a name in reference to an individual as well as a people's identity. And then we're going to get down into the inner sanctums of the name Huron, where it came from, why we have it today, and also take a quick look at the name Wyandotte. So we looked at this quote from James Mooney at the gathering, and it kind of sets the context on why looking at our names is so important. Because here Mooney has a nice quote where he says, "The Indian regards his name not as a mere label, but as a distinct part of his personality, just as much as are his eyes or his teeth, and believes that injury will result as surely from the malicious handling of his name as from a wound inflicted on any part of his physical organism." So as we go through these slides in reference to the name Huron, see if what Mr. Mooney says right there is applicable to the name that we have for ourselves in regards to the name Huron. So it's all about the name. A name identifies the uniqueness of an individual, no less than the name identifies the uniqueness of a people, a nation. And like with our traditions, there is no way that two people could have ever had the same name. An individual carried their unique name, and it could not be shared with anyone else throughout the whole nation. Likewise, on the Great Island, two nations could have never shared the same name. There were these specific elements within the shamanic society that our ancestors lived that were critically important, because a person or an inanimate object was identified with specific descriptions according to their name, locations, size, color, anything else that would have been a very specific descriptive of who they were was very important to their unique identity. In contrast to that, within the European society, it was permissible for many different individuals to share the same name. That's why there are so many different Johns and Janes and all of those names that float around. And within Europe, there could have been hundreds and hundreds of people that shared the same name. And for the longest of time, it really didn't matter if they shared the same name. The confusion or misidentification of these individuals was, who cared? But in North America, the names on the Great Island were critical. And when Cartier came to the New World, he kind of brought some of those European ideologies with him that didn't settle well with the people that he was beginning to intermingle with in the New World. When he first came to the New World, he just basically sailed around Newfoundland, within the Gulf of St. Lawrence, and around the Gaspe Peninsula. He made some contact with a few of the native peoples, but he didn't really get that involved with them until his second trip. In his second trip to North America on September 7th, 1535, he reached the village of Steinkona. And it was at Steinkona that Cartier addressed Chief Donnacona. And Chief Donnacona and the citizens of Steinkona have been named today the St. Lawrence Iroquoians. And Cartier is credited with being the first to make contact with these people. While at Steinkona, Cartier addressed Chief Donnacona, went up and did his formal introduction of himself as representative of the King of France, And there was a lot of pleasantries that were most likely exchanged. But the problem is, as we'll see here in a little bit, neither one of the two chiefs could understand what the other was saying. At Stadacona, the city of Quebec now resides. A month later, or thereabout, Cartier reached the village of Hochelaga, and that is the location of the city of Montreal. While wintering in North America, he settled in with the natives and got to know them fairly well. He collected quite a bit of information regarding the language, and that gave us some of the first glimpses into the Iroquois peoples that were living along the St. Lawrence waterway. In April of 1536, Cartier kidnapped Donnacona and two of his sons. He returned back to Stadacona, took the chief and his two elder sons, and went his way back to France with captives in the bottom of the ship. That's a nice way to leave the people that you have just met and learned to live with for the last several months. Stealing their chief and their two most important sons was not the best way to leave a friendship. But Cartier wanted to bring back to his king the people who he thought could best tell them on how to reach the land of China. If you can picture Cartier standing in front of Donnacona, this might be something that he said to him as kind of an introduction, as establishing who was the chief in charge, if you will. And for those of you that might be able to read French, just kind of keep what this says to yourself. And we'll take a look at it a little bit later and do a quick little translation of it. Does anybody in the group speak or read French, just out of curiosity?
I can read it.
Okay.
I can make it out.
I have been using Google Translate, and it works great for those of us that do not know French. It helps to read some of these old books. So get yourself a copy of Google Translate and open up a whole new world for a lot of history out there. So as Chief Donnacona was looking at Cartier when he was addressing him, all Chief Donnacona could do was really sit there and smile. As we noted, both of the two men didn't understand a word that the other was saying. And after Cartier makes his presentation, it wouldn't be that much out of the imagination to see where Donnacona says back to him something similar to this. And this is in Wyandotte. Yahi te jamais, yondao ek wadika. And any of you, CC, do you know what that says in Wyandotte? You've been working on the language. We'll just do a quick translation of it. And this is using Dr. Copras's words. So after a big discourse from Cartier, it wouldn't have been out of the question for Donnacona to say, welcome, thank you, my home is your fire. Meaning, this is my home, this is your home, make yourself a part of the family and come in and just become a part of us. And Cartier did, but he didn't really leave the relationship there under good standing. So Champlain came to New France in 1603, about 70 years after Cartier had left. In 1608, Champlain established Quebec City on the site where Stadacona once stood. When Cartier came, there was a flourishing population, but when Champlain came to the same site, the St. Lawrence Iroquois had mysteriously disappeared. And by this time, there had been a number of different excursions from Frenchmen. Most of them were not there representing the king. They were there looking for gold and riches and a way to China. But many of the French sailors and explorers had come to New France, and they had intermingled with the native peoples, and they began to call the people in New France Hurons. That name, as we will see, means what? What was a Huron? And the people north of the St. Lawrence Waterway and the Great Lake Ontario were all pretty much universally referred to as Hurons. And the name kind of came about, or a belief came about from the early to mid 18th century from Shovelocks, that the name was in reference to the wild boars of Europe, that the sailors and explorers would see these native men walking around with the mohawk or a roach on their hair, and it reminded them of the wild boars in Europe. Shovelocks kind of developed this theory as to how the name Huron came about, and it basically was a distracting folktale. There on the back of the boar over here in the picture, you can see that little ruff on his head. And would that make you think, if you saw a mohawk on a man, would that make you think of a wild pig in Europe? Probably not. So the name Huron really has nothing to do with the wild pigs. Unfortunately for the name, the connotation that it's referencing is much worse than that of a wild pig. In France at this time, there was a class, there was a society that was very rigid. People were basically born into a class, and they pretty much stayed in that same class until the day they died. The ultimate class to be in was the king, the queen, and his royal family. They were basically a class unto themselves. The class just below them was the third class, and it was the clergy. The upper and lower clergy basically spoke for God. And the king was considered in many ways a representative of God as well. So the upper and lower clergy held a high position in the third class, right below that of the royal family. The second estate, the middle class, if you will, was known as the nobility of the sword and the nobility of the robe. There were two divisions in there. The sword was higher than the robe, and the sword was positions within the army, the government, and the church that was not part of the third estate. The nobility of the robe were high professionals in banking, finance, manufacturing, places in the French society where they had a lot of direct influence over the different classes. And the lower class, the first estate, was the bourgeoisie, the artisans, and the peasants. But now, since New France had been located and the French were making their little waves into North America, a new class was basically established, and it was the Hurons. The Hurons were the lowest of the lowest class within the first estate of French society, meaning that the Hurons were something less than the poorest peasants that existed in France. Here's our quote again from Cartier to Donnacona. And Melinda, do you want to translate that for us or give us an idea of what it says?
You're a stupid Indian. Vous êtes negelé. I'm not sure what negelé is, but you're the next. It's you are a something, a knave, a ruffian, a lout, a wretch. You're a deplorable hillbilly. You're a Huron. Rejects sans valeur de la. You're the rejects of society.
Very good. That translate, you stupid Indian. You are unkept, a knave, ruffian, lout, a wretch. You are a deplorable hillbilly. You are a Huron, society's worthless reject. So you have this representative of the king. You have Cartier standing in front of the chief of chiefs of all the St. Louis Iroquoians, and he is speaking. We're just assuming this. We're speaking to this chief in these type of terms because this society in Europe, in France, would have looked at this chief as being a reject, somebody that was absolutely worthless within society of old France.
He also they also use the familiar term of you. So instead of you would never address someone with, if you go back one slide to the toi, you would use a different word if you were being polite. So also the language being chosen is putting them down.
Yeah, the words themselves are choices, just like in a name. You're absolutely right. The the way we talk today in society, we just throw words here and there as though they're just meaningless and worthless. But our choice of words that we use can elevate or demote people in many times without them even knowing that they're being insulted by just the choice use of a word. When I put this together, I use the name hillbilly. Because if you read in The Children of the Tenzing, when Bruce Trigger is talking about the name Huron, he actually equates the way in which the men and the women looked as being North American hillbillies. They were just the dregs of society in New France, if you will, that had holes in their clothes and no shoes. They were barefoot, they were dirty, or so the Europeans thought. So they were hillbillies. They were worthless rejects. And that is the way in which the French began to interact with all the different tribes in North America. John Hewitt agreed with Bruce Trigger, and he said that the name Huron frequently was an added epithet like villain, a base. It was used in France as early as 1358 as a name expressly of continuity, contempt, and insulting, signifying approximately an unkept person, knave, ruffian, lout, or wretch. So that is what the French looked at the Indians of the Great Island to be: wretches, ruffians, just a bunch of savages and barbarians. The French, they didn't care what the people called themselves. In many ways, the natives were Hurons, and they were unworthy of having a name. The French called the people Hurons, and whatever the Wyandotte called their neighbors is what they actually began to call the people. For example, well, the French were looking upon the Wyandotte as the highest ranking of all the Hurons. They were a little bit in the higher echelon of the wretches here in North America. And to give an idea of how the French kind of named these people, these different nations, the Huron nation neutral was the Neutral Confederacy. And the Wyandotte called these people the Hattawandaronk, which signify the people that spoke a little bit different in their speech. The French called the Chilantati, which was the name given to the Chilantati by the Wyandotte, people of the mountains. The French actually called them the nation of the Patoon, or the Tobacco Nation. And both of these names right here, none of them, all four of those names, have absolutely nothing to do with the name that the people called themselves. So the names that the people are using to describe these different nations are not even the names that the people call themselves. They are bestowed names. The name Huron was dominant throughout New France. In 1639, Father Lalemant preserved another name. Lalemant was a Jesuit priest laboring among the Huron mission. And that Huron mission will be important for us here in a little bit. But Lalemant was walking through this village one day that was a village within the Huron Confederacy. And he just walked up to a citizen and he stopped and he looked at him and said, "What do you call yourselves?" Because nobody had asked these people, "What is your name?" And the individual that Lalemant was talking to replied, "We are Wyandottes." And Wyandottes translate as the inhabitant of an island. That is basically the only name of any of the tribes, or in this case, the Confederacy of 4 tribes that we know of the Iroquois people north of the St. Lawrence and the Great Lake Ontario. All of the other names are just made up names given to the people either by the French or the Wyandotte themselves. We're not going to read this because if you just take a look at it, you can see it's a mess. Francis Parkman, when he was trying to identify all of the different names of the Hurons and the Jesuits of North America, this is how he described the chaos and the confusion that basically circled around the use of the names. Names from the French, names from the explorers, names from the people themselves. It was just a nightmare to try and figure out who these people were in relation to their names. In 1649, the Iroquois defeated and absolutely destroyed the Wyandottes. Their confederacy was annihilated. Likewise, in 1649 to 50, the Iroquois destroyed the Chilantati. In 1651, 1652, the Iroquois destroyed the Hattawandorok. And you can see the pattern that's going on here in North America. The Iroquoian Confederacy is just annihilating all of their cousins, whether it be fellow Iroquoian tribes or Algonquian. They didn't care. They're literally destroying nations of people. In 1651, survivors of the Wyandotte fled east to Quebec. The people that fled east were the remnants of one of the Wyandotte tribes, and I'm not going to try and pronounce their name right there. But this is the only tribe of the four within the Wyandotte Confederacy that survived. And they eventually became known as the Huron of Lorette, or in time, the Huron-Wyandotte of Wendake, which is who we know them to be today. In 1652, survivors of the Chilantati and the Hattawandorok fled west, and they eventually settled in the Wisconsin wilderness. The three names of our three parent tribes, as you see there, I'm not even going to name them because those, again, are not names that are given to us by ourselves. Those three names are the names that the Wyandottes called our grandparents. But if we can identify them more appropriately, the turtle, deer, and wolf people are who are the three parent tribes of our tribe. There were other remnant peoples that actually were incorporated into this new tribe, and one of the most noted was the Bear people. And these people are a partial remnant of some of one of the other tribes that come out of the Wyandottes. So the turtle, deer, and wolf are primarily who we became as a tribe, with incorporations of other people such as the bear. After the dispersals, obviously a new nation was formed. What was the name of this new nation? We don't really know. The name by which we became a tribe is kind of lost in history. In 1659, Radisson was out on the western shore of the Great Lake Superior, and he is intermingling with these people that have gathered out in the middle of nowhere within the region of the Chequamegon, however you pronounce that bay. And he is intermingling with these people that have gathered there basically to kind of cohabitate and give themselves protection from the Iroquoian people who are actually pushing way deep into the western areas of the Wisconsin and Minnesota countries. So you have Algonquian and Siouan people that are gathered out there. And Radisson comes across another people group that just stand out like a sore thumb. They're not Algonquian, they're not Siouan. He doesn't really know who they are. They're just oddly and uniquely different. So Radisson returns back to Montreal in 1660. And while he's there, he gives a report to Father Rene Menard. The description of the people that Radisson gives to Menard is quick to identify these people as remnant of the Huron mission. These people are Huron, and he doesn't know their name, but he knows that they came from the Huron mission because he actually served in the mission among these people. These people were not identified as coming out of the Confederacy, which history says they did. They came out of the Huron mission, which is the extended church that was set up by the Jesuits throughout all of Ontario. And it incorporated many different tribes, both Iroquoian as well as Algonquian. So Menard identifies these people out in the middle of Wisconsin among the Algonquian and Siouan people. He identifies them as Huron, and the name stuck. This new tribe of people came to be known in history as the Huron tribe. They were exiles in the middle of nowhere, and this new name stuck to them like flypaper. Why did this new tribe accept the name Huron? Why did this new tribe not insist that their given name be used? At this time, did these people know what Huron actually meant? That it was a very derogatory name, insulting name, meant to belittle and cause these people to have no position as a human being on the face of the earth? Why did these people care? Did they have a name for themselves? Well, sure they did. But at this particular point in time, if you are one of the nations wanting to do business with the French, and the trade out in the West with pelts of fur was just flourishing. Our grandmas and grandpas tapped into the reserve of pelts that were coming out of the far western realm of Canada, and they were getting rich, being middlemen now for the French with all these pelts coming out from the West going back to the East. And in order to do business with the French, you had to basically allow the French to meddle within your tribal business. And if you wanted to do business with the French, you had to kiss a little bit of their derriere. These people had no other choice if they wanted to deal with the French. They had to allow the French to call them Hurons. And they did that for a little while. And I like this quote from Charles Bucer. He basically said that the tribe at this particular point in time, they had a lot more to worry about than what somebody called them by a name. And I like that from Bucer because there was so much going on at this particular point in time. The people didn't care if you called them Huron or whatever other name that you chose. They were struggling to survive, and they were trying to make themselves in a position to not only struggle to survive, but flourish among this new trade that was going on with the beaver pelts. So the name Huron in 1666 was confirmed by Father Aloes. He actually called these refugees not just Huron, but I'm not going to pronounce that long name there. We're going to call them by the name that we know them today, the Wyandotte. So Aloes was out west. He made contact with these people, and he goes, "Ha! You're not just Hurons. I know specifically who you are. You are the Wyandotte." And he went on to identify these people in his journal by the missionary with whom they were serving under. This Father Garnier was the missionary that had been assigned to the Wyandotte, and he knew the father and he knew the people, and he identified them for who they were. They were Wyandotte, not just Hurons in general. So at this time, in 1672, the Huron tribe, as they are now known, got chased out of Wisconsin. Our grandmas and grandpas were a little bit on the confident and arrogant side of life. They had weapons, they had this contact with the Europeans, they had this idea that they were pretty special, and they decided to pick a fight with the Sioux to try and conquer the Sioux and take their land. Well, it didn't work too well. Out of 100 warriors that were sent out to attack the Sioux, only one returned. And that one came back and said, "We cannot do anything against these Sioux people again because they are just like mosquitoes. They inhabit the western lands by the tens of thousands." So the Huron tribe left the Wisconsin country and went to Michilimackinac with Father Marquette, and they stayed there until 1701, 1703. So the Hurons were eventually invited to come down to Fort Detroit by Cadillac, and they slowly began that migration from Mackinac Island down to Detroit. And while in Detroit, they had disagreements not only with the Sioux, but the Mascoutin, the Fox, the Ottawa, the Seneca, the French themselves, and they had problems with their own people. These new people called Huron began to fight a little bit among themselves. because at this time, it was literally impossible for them to not remember who was turtle, who was deer, and who was wolf. The way in which the clans were so impregnated through society, even after almost 100 years of being out from the homeland, these people still knew from where they came. They knew their original place within the society. In 1747, there were tribal disagreements that were easily to identified, and the people were easily to agree, hey, we got some problems. The disagreements with the French were also agreeable. A faction of the Huron tribe was devoutly loyal to the French. A faction of the Huron tribe was very displeased with the French, and they wanted to basically move. They wanted to get out of the French control that was dominant over Fort Detroit. The French, the faction of the Huron tribe that was displeased with the French, they actually wanted to try and form this relationship with the English, because the English were beginning to move out into the Ohio country. And these people saw the English and thought, they look to be pretty nice people. So the French were just unhappy people. They didn't like anyone. Nobody really liked them. But the French, all they wanted to do was to keep their Indian allies, keep them under control, because they saw that a war was coming with the English. And they needed these allies in order to combat the English. Nicholas was most likely the tribe's war pole at this time. Nicholas was a porcupine, and he identified himself as one of the turtle people. Nicholas wanted to stop bending over to the French derriere, and he wanted to tell the French, leave. If you don't leave, I'm leaving. So in 1747, Nicholas went to the French and asked for permission to leave Fort Detroit area. And they said no. And that's kind of hard for us to imagine today, where one of the nations had to go to the French and ask for permission to come and go among the land that they claimed as their own. But the French denied Nicholas' request. He turned against the French in revolt and attempted to lay siege to Fort Detroit and kill all the Frenchmen. It failed. His attempt didn't go very far, and because of the failure that he faced, he had to promptly leave and go into the Ohio country. In about another 70 years or so, Nicholas, his grandson, was Donquat, the half king. And Donquat was best known in history as Pomoakan. Pomoakan was the undisputed leader of the Indian Alliance during the American Revolution. So right now in 1747, we have Nicholas, Donquat's grandfather, struggling to find identity among his people, trying to find a way in which he can insert his people into the society, not only that the Europeans were dominating in North America, but also into the society of the different nations. And within the 70 years that his grandson came about and was the half king of all the nations that were part of the Indian Alliance during the American Revolution, it showed you how far these people came in such a very short amount of time, where they were seeking identity, and then they became the epitome of identity with all the nations in the Ohio country. Because of Nicholas's revolt against the French and his moving into the Ohio country, on September 6th, 1748, he sent one of his representatives to meet Colonel Conrad Weiser. Weiser was a Pennsylvania Dutchman. He was an Englishman who had been tasked with going out into the Ohio country, making contact with the different tribes and making them allies to the English. This meeting that took place actually took place in Pennsylvania at Logstown. And Weiser, in his journal, made a very monumental note. In his journal on September 6, 1748, he made this obvious and incredible discovery. He said that he had counsel with the Wyandottes, otherwise called the Inondante Haggis, which that's the name that the Iroquois called the Wyandottes. This name right here, Wyandotte, is the first one of the first known records of the name Wyandotte preserved in history. And this name Wyandotte doesn't show up until September 6th, 1748. Basically, what happened is Nicholas went out from the suffocating control that the French had around Fort Detroit. He went out from among their oppression. And he also stepped away from his fellow Hurons to express his ancient tribal identity. The name Wyandotte became anglicized as Wyandotte. And that anglicization was not from the name Wendat, as it's historically said, it's from the name Wyandotte. The name Wyandotte is actually villagers. So Nicholas was expressing the true identity of himself as an individual and as a people. These people were not Hurons, they were Wyandottes, they were villagers. And if you look at the name, it's appropriate for the people to call themselves villagers because the Iroquois people basically were identified by their longhouses, they were identified by their palisades, they were identified by their community in both life and death. They lived in the longhouse and they were buried after death in the ossuaries together as one people. The longhouses, the palisades, maize, matron locality, all of that defined the Ontario Iroquoian tradition, the villagers. So where we have in today's society this name Iroquoian, the actual true name of the people, in my opinion, is Wyandotte, villagers. And this is the name that Nicholas representative spoke to the English that became anglicized as Wyandotte. Wyandotte over the next 20 years went through a whole phase of different spellings. And this is just a few of the different spellings that we see predominantly at this place and time. Oddly, one of the most common spellings is the WYANDOT. That was very commonly used through a lot of documents, and in time it just got solidified as WYANDOT. Does anybody know why we spell the name WYANDOTT from time to time? Does anybody know the background of that name?
William Walker Jr. used it.
Absolutely correct. That is a spelling that William Walker Jr. basically penned in most of his documents. And he was so influential during the early 18 to mid 1800s that the name basically just stuck, because when William Walker Jr. wrote the name Wyandotte, it was with a double T. And it just became very prevalent throughout history at that time because of his unprecedented influence. So the name Wyandotte with WYANDOTTE, where did that name come from? What's its source? Does anybody know?
U.S. government.
Yeah, it's French. It's got a French background. And it was basically given to the tribe when we were reinstated from the treaty of 69 in Indian Territory that became Oklahoma. To differentiate between the Wyandotte and the Wyandotte, the US government put the extra TE on the name to give that separation and differentiation between the Wyandotte that stayed in Kansas and Canada, and the Wyandotte that were reinstated as a federally recognized tribe in Indian Territory that became Oklahoma. So this is a name that was given to us by the United States of America. Our name truly is WYANDAT, Wyandotte. And the most common spelling of that nowadays is Wyandotte. And of course, the Wyandotte Nation is who we are today, thanks to the United States of America. So the name Wyandotte throughout history is frequently seen as Huron. The name Huron is identified with the people that lived in the area of Detroit, Brownstown, and Magua. The name Wyandotte in history is commonly identified with the people that lived in Sandusky, either upper or lower. So the two names, Detroit, Sandusky, were basically used side by side simultaneously, and they're synonymous one with the other. Regardless of which name was used, either Huron or Wyandotte, the people self-identified as being one and the same. Quick summarization. The Huron Confederacy has no relevancy to the Huron tribe. The name is the same on the Confederacy, which that's a confederacy of 4 people. And then the Huron tribe is a amalgamation of 3 different tribes that had no relation to the Huron Confederacy. And that is a big mistake that's made in the history books, the assumption that the Huron tribe is a continuation of the Huron Confederacy, and that is completely untrue. After the dispersal of 1652, it took 8 years for the people to be named the Huron tribe. After being named the Huron tribe, it took about 88 years for the name Wyandotte to finally emerge in history and be recorded. The French at Detroit most likely had heard the people speaking the name Wyandotte. It didn't just happen that the people walked into Pennsylvania and said, we're Wyandotte. They had been speaking the name for no telling how long, but the French basically ignored the name and refused to acknowledge the name. Because when you identify the name of the people that are around you, you give them purpose, you give them meaning. And the French kept wanting to hold a little bit of suppressive support over these people and continue to call them Hurons. So the two names Huron and Wyandotte are synonymous one with the other. Because of the derogatory term that is placed upon the name Huron, a lot of people don't like to use that name nowadays because it is such a horrid name when you look at the way in which it was applied to the people and the purpose for why it was used. But if we eliminate the name Huron because we just don't like it because it's derogatory, we are in many ways erasing almost 100 years of our history. If we have people go back and do research on the Wyandotte people and they aren't familiar with the name Huron tribe and know that the Huron tribe is the same as the Wyandotte tribe, they lose so much history of our people that we cannot set that name aside. That's why today, when you see a lot of stuff that I write, things that I do, I've begun to write the name as Huron Wyandotte, because using the name Huron, using the name Wyandotte properly identifies our ancestors and the place that they held in history from the time of dispersal all the way up to today. As a result of the malicious handling of the Wyandotte's name by the French, the people and a tribe are forever stuck with the name Huron. Because of this, there is no doubt that our name is the most difficult and confusing element of our history. So hopefully tonight, breaking down a little bit of how we got the name Huron and from how it came to be applied to us makes it a little bit easier for everybody to see how the name is applicable to us and how it has no contact back to the Huron Confederacy, the Wyandottes. We are a unique people. Unfortunately, we just got branded with this name that became universal to a lot of tribes. And because of the application of that name to a lot of tribes, these tribes became unfamiliar with people in history. They lost their identity, which caused a lot of problems for us all the way up to today. Sources for everybody to look at, and that's all. Any questions? That's a lot of stuff, and that took a little bit longer than I hoped.
I couldn't help thinking while you were talking, Lloyd, about how this parallels how women disappear in history with their last name.
Correct. Yeah.
Yeah. And so it's really, part of that whole European patriarchal format.
That is true.
Yeah.
The way in which the Europeans came over, and I think they didn't have much time to recognize that there was such an unprecedented sense of equality among the people. The men and the women held equal positions within society, and that just completely blew the Europeans' mind. And because it was in direct contrast with how they lived in Europe, the best way that they could deal with that was to suppress everything. So they took away the identity of the people, they took away the identity of the genders, they took away the identity of the society, and just tried to suppress it to the point that the people themselves had no idea who they were. They tried to make them little Europeans, and it didn't work that well for them. Any more insights, ideas, thoughts? Everybody comfortable with the name Huron and how it applies to us?
I just think when I'm trying to tell people who Wyandotte are, and I reference Huron, they go, oh yeah. And then they kind of put us in a place. They understand kind of the Great Lakes. And so oddly enough, in a way, it helps people kind of understand where we're from.
Well, years ago, I had a lady on the ambulance that I was providing care to, and I could tell that she was Native. And little by little in the conversation, we got to talking back and forth, and she identified herself as Lakota. She was Sioux. And I kind of went, oh, that's nice. And I mentioned to her the history of our grandparents with her grandparents, and I told her about the Wyandotte, and she really didn't know who the Wyandotte were. And then I mentioned that we're also known as the Huron, and she went, oh,
Well,
you're one of them. So people do recognize the name Huron. They know that from a historical perspective prior to the 1800s, because that is who we were known by from the dispersal, the mid 1650s, all the way up to the mid 1750s. So it is a name that we carry that's very derogatory, but yet at the same time, because of who our grandparents were, our grandparents brought a lot of honor and respect to that name, in spite of what the French tried to do by belittling the people by the use of a very derogatory and horrid name within their society. So sometimes that shows that a name that you give somebody will never lower that individual to fit the name, because the people elevate the name to fit the person. And our grandparents did that very well with the name Huron. And we can speak the name very, very confidently with pride, knowing that our grandparents, they took that name to places that the French never believed could have been achieved. And people know who the Huron people are. And people, likewise, know who the Wyandotte people are, because we did some amazing things in the Ohio country from the time of the American Revolution until we left in 1843. So we got two names that we can be very proud of. Any more ideas? Okay, good stuff. And I can't remember what we had talked about discussing next month. Take a look at my notes, and it might give us a little bit of ideas as to what we can maybe bring and discuss next time. So can you believe that we're already in October?